I'm Jessica Martinez, 28 years old, and 3 months ago, my parents handed my sister Amanda a check for $500,000 while looking me dead in the eye and saying I deserved nothing. For years, I watched them shower her with money, opportunities, and endless second chances, while I scraped together student loans and worked double shifts just to finish my MBA. I thought I knew how cruel family favoritism could get, but I had no idea what was coming. When I found what my grandmother had hidden in her old house, everything changed. The look on my parents' faces when I walked into that family dinner with those documents will haunt them forever. And honestly, they had it coming. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun was already blazing through my tiny apartment window in Tempe when my phone buzzed with a text from my mother, Linda. Family dinner tonight at the Phoenician Grill. 7 sharp. Don't be late. No please, no explanation, just another command disguised as an invitation. I stared at the message while sipping lukewarm coffee from a chipped mug, the same mug I'd been using since my sophomore year because buying new dishes wasn't exactly in my budget. My studio apartment was clean but sparse, furnished with hand-me-downs and thrift store finds that I'd somehow made look decent through sheer determination and creative arrangement. The contrast between my life and Amanda's couldn't have been starker. While I was measuring coffee grounds to make them last another week, my 32-year-old sister was probably lounging by the pool of her Paradise Valley mansion, the one my parents had helped her buy with that massive check. $500,000. The number still made my stomach clench every time I thought about it. I'd been working part-time at Desert Brew Coffee Shop for 3 years, grinding through my MBA classes at night, accumulating debt like it was a hobby, all while watching my parents fund Amanda's lifestyle without a second thought. I grabbed my backpack and headed to campus, trying to shake off the familiar resentment that always surfaced when family obligations loomed. Arizona State University's business building was already buzzing with activity, students rushing between classes with the kind of energy I used to have before exhaustion became my permanent state. Professor Williams was reviewing our final project requirements when I slipped into advanced financial management, my mind still stuck on that dinner invitation. Only 8 weeks left until graduation, 8 weeks until I could finally start my career in earnest, and my parents were still treating me like an afterthought. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, about to graduate with honors from one of the top MBA programs in the state, and my parents had never once acknowledged my academic achievements. Amanda had dropped out of Arizona State during her sophomore year to find herself, which apparently involved a series of failed relationships and half-hearted attempts at various careers, none of which lasted more than 6 months. Yet somehow she was the one who got the management position at Martinez Construction Company, our family's successful contracting business that my grandmother Rosa and grandfather Miguel had built from nothing. Dominated the discussion with stories about her latest shopping sprees and vacation plans, while Kevin nodded along like everything she said was profound wisdom. My parents hung on every word, asking follow-up questions and offering encouragement in a way they'd never done with my academic achievements or career aspirations. "Jessica, how are your classes going?" my father asked during a lull in Amanda's monologue, his tone suggesting polite obligation rather than genuine interest. "Good. I'll be graduating in 8 weeks," I replied, though I might as well have said I was learning to juggle for all the enthusiasm it generated. "That's nice, dear," my mother said absently, already turning back to Amanda. "So tell us more about this interior designer you found for the guest bathroom." I picked at my salad while Amanda launched into a detailed description of marble tiles and imported fixtures, each item worth more than most people's monthly salary. This was my life, sitting on the sidelines while my sister basked in parental attention and financial support that seemed to flow endlessly in her direction. I'd accepted it years ago, or thought I had, but tonight the familiar sting felt sharper somehow. The main course arrived, and with it, the moment I'd been dreading. My father cleared his throat and raised his wine glass, a signal that meant an announcement was coming. The table fell silent, all eyes on him as he smiled that paternal smile reserved for family milestones. "Your mother and I have been doing a lot of thinking lately," he began, his voice carrying the weight of importance. "About the future.
about family, about what we want to leave behind. My stomach tightened. Inheritance talks always meant good news for Amanda and disappointment for me, but something about his tone tonight felt more final than usual. Amanda, you've been such a blessing to this family, he continued, his eyes soft with affection as he looked at my sister. You've brought joy and laughter into our lives. And Kevin, you've been the son we never had. Kevin preened under the praise, while Amanda dabbed at her eyes, already emotional before the punchline arrived. Which is why we've decided to leave everything to you, my father said simply. The house, the business, all of our assets. You're our legacy, sweetheart. The words hit me like a physical blow. Everything. Not just favoritism or special treatment, but literally everything they'd built, everything our grandparents had worked for, everything I'd watched grow and develop through my childhood summers at the construction company. Amanda burst into tears, reaching across the table to grab their hands, while Kevin's chest puffed with satisfaction. We know Jessica will be fine, my mother added, her voice carefully modulated to sound reasonable. She's always been so independent, so capable of taking care of herself. She doesn't need our help the way Amanda does. Independent. The word tasted bitter in my mouth. Independent because I'd had no choice? Because they'd never offered help in the first place. Independent because while they were writing checks for Amanda's every whim, I was working multiple jobs to pay for school. Independent because I'd learned early that asking for support would only lead to lectures about self-reliance while they handed Amanda another blank check. I don't understand, I managed to say, my voice sounding distant and strange. Not even a portion? Not even something small? My father's expression hardened slightly, the warmth reserved for Amanda nowhere to be found. Jessica, you have your education, your degree. You'll have a good career. Amanda needs security, stability. She's not equipped to handle life the way you are. Not equipped. As if being spoiled and enabled was a disability rather than a choice they'd made for her. As if my capability was a punishment rather than an achievement. I stared at my half-eaten dinner, trying to process what I'd just heard. Complete disinheritance wasn't just about money. It was about belonging, about worth. About 28 years of feeling like a stranger in my own family finally being made official. The lawyer is drawing up the new will this week, my mother said, her tone gentle but firm. We wanted you to hear it from us first, rather than being surprised later. Surprised. What a delicate way to describe discovering you'd been written out of your family's legacy entirely. I nodded numbly, not trusting my voice to remain steady if I tried to speak. Amanda was still crying, overwhelmed by the magnitude of her good fortune, while my parents basked in her grateful tears. Kevin had already started talking about expansion plans for the business, mapping out a future that had no place for me in it. The rest of dinner passed in a haze. I made appropriate sounds when conversation required it, but my mind was reeling with the implications of what I'd just learned. This wasn't just about money, though the financial security would have been life-changing. It was about validation, about feeling like I mattered to the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. Instead, I was being told that my sister, who'd never worked a real job or faced genuine hardship, deserved everything, while I deserved nothing. When the check came, my father paid it without question, another casual display of the wealth that would never benefit me. As we prepared to leave, Amanda pulled me aside, her eyes still wet with happy tears. I hope you're not upset, she said, though her tone suggested she wasn't particularly concerned about my feelings. Mom and Dad are right, you know. You're so strong, so capable. You don't need their help like I do. I managed a weak smile, the same polite mask I'd worn my entire life when dealing with family dynamics that made no sense. I'm happy for you, I lied, because what else was there to say? Driving home through the dark Phoenix streets, I felt hollowed out and empty, like something essential had been scraped away, leaving only a shell behind. My apartment felt smaller than usual when I finally walked through the door. the secondhand furniture and bare walls suddenly seeming less like charming frugality and more like evidence of my complete disconnection from my family's wealth. I sat on my threadbare couch and called Tyler, needing to hear a friendly voice before the silence drove me crazy. "How bad was it?" he asked immediately, recognizing the strain in my voice. "They're leaving everything to Amanda," I said, the words coming out flat and emotionless. "The house, the business, all of it. I get nothing." Tyler was quiet for a long moment, and I could practically hear him processing the information. As a lawyer, he understood the implications better than most. "Jess, that's insane. You're their daughter, too. You've worked harder than Amanda your entire life." "Apparently, that doesn't matter. I'm too independent, too capable. I don't need help the way she does." That's the most
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Backwards logic I've ever heard, Tyler said, his voice tight with anger on my behalf. Punishing you for being responsible while rewarding her for being helpless? We talked for another hour, Tyler's outrage helping to validate feelings I'd been questioning since dinner. Maybe I was being too sensitive. Maybe I should be grateful for my education and independence. Maybe my parents were right about Amanda needing more support. But Tyler's perspective, clear-eyed and unbiased, confirmed what my heart already knew. This wasn't about need or capability. It was about favoritism so deeply ingrained, it had become invisible to everyone except its victim. After hanging up, I lay in bed staring at the dark ceiling, my mind churning through years of memories that suddenly made perfect sense. The missed school events, because they were at Amanda's dance recitals. The used car I'd bought with my own money, while they leased Amanda a brand new sedan. The constant comparisons that always favored her spontaneity over my planning, her creativity over my practicality, her charm over my reliability. I'd spent my entire life trying to earn their approval through achievement, thinking that if I just worked hard enough, succeeded enough, proved myself enough, I'd finally matter as much as Amanda did. Tonight had shattered that illusion completely. No amount of success would ever make them see me as worthy of their investment, because the problem wasn't my performance, it was their perception. But as I drifted toward sleep, something else was stirring beneath the hurt and disappointment. A memory of my grandmother Rosa, her weathered hands holding mine as she talked about fairness and justice in her accented English. She died 6 months ago, and I'd been too busy with school and work to spend much time at her house afterward. My parents had handled most of her affairs, settling her estate with the same efficiency they brought to business matters. Rosa had always been different from my parents, treating Amanda and me with equal affection and interest. She'd been proud of my education, excited about my career prospects, and quietly critical of Amanda's lack of direction. During her last few years, she'd grown increasingly frustrated with my parents' favoritism, though she'd usually kept her opinions to herself. Now, lying in the dark with my family's latest betrayal fresh in my mind, I found myself wondering what Rosa would have thought about tonight's announcement. She'd built that business alongside my grandfather Miguel, working 12-hour days and sacrificing creature comforts to establish the foundation my parents now took for granted. Would she have wanted it all to go to Amanda, who'd never shown the slightest interest in the company's history or values? The thought planted a seed of curiosity that would grow over the coming days, though I didn't realize it yet. For now, I was just a 28-year-old woman processing the reality that her parents valued her so little, they'd rather give everything to her irresponsible sister than acknowledge her years of hard work and dedication. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new questions, and eventually, discoveries that would change everything. But tonight, I grieved her the relationship I'd always wanted with my parents, and finally accepted I'd never have. The next morning arrived with a phone call that would crack open everything I thought I knew about my family. I was nursing my second cup of coffee, still processing the emotional hangover from dinner, when my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. The voice on the other end was crisp and professional, belonging to Mr. Harrison Burke from Burke & Associates, the law firm that had handled my grandmother's estate. "Miss Martinez, I apologize for calling so early, but I've discovered some documents in your grandmother's safety deposit box that require immediate attention. Could you meet me at my office this afternoon?" My grandmother had a safety deposit box? This was news to me. My parents had never mentioned it when settling her affairs, and I had assumed everything had been handled months ago. Something in Mr. Burke's tone suggested this wasn't a routine matter, and after last night's bombshell, I wasn't sure I could handle any more family surprises. "What kind of documents?" I asked, gripping the phone tighter. "I'd prefer to discuss this in person, Miss Martinez. Would 2 o'clock work for you?" The rest of the morning dragged by as I tried to focus on my advanced corporate strategy assignment, but my mind kept wandering to that phone call. Why would my grandmother's lawyer need to see me specifically? Why hadn't my parents been contacted? And why was this surfacing now, 6 months after her death? I arrived at Burke & Associates 10 minutes early, my palms sweating despite the Phoenix heat being nothing compared to the anxiety churning in my stomach. The law office was located in a glass tower downtown, its marble lobby and expensive artwork radiating the kind of success that made me acutely aware of my student budget wardrobe. Mr. Burke's assistant, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes, led me to a conference room where Harrison Burke was waiting. Mr. Burke was probably in his early 60s, with silver hair and the measured demeanor of someone who'd spent decades delivering life-changing news to unprepared families. He stood when I entered, extending a firm handshake before gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "Miss Martinez, thank you for coming on such short notice. I'll get straight to the point, because what I'm about to show you is quite significant." He opened a manila folder and withdrew several documents, spreading them across the polished conference table. "Your grandmother, Rosa, maintained a safety deposit box that she never disclosed to your parents. When the bank contacted our office about unclaimed contents, we discovered these." The first document he slid toward me was handwritten in my grandmother's distinctive script, the careful penmanship of someone who'd learned English as a second language but took pride in getting every letter right. It was dated just 3 months before her death, and as I read the opening lines, my breath caught in my throat. "To my beloved granddaughter Jessica, if you are reading this, it means I am gone, and my fears about your parents' intentions have proven correct." My hands trembled. As I continued reading, Rosa's letter detailed years of growing concern about my parents' treatment of Amanda and me, their obvious favoritism, and their apparent plans to exclude me from any inheritance. She'd watched them enable Amanda's irresponsibility while taking my hard work for granted, and it had troubled her deeply. "I built Martinez Construction with my grandfather Miguel, working 16-hour days and saving every penny to create something lasting for our family, not just for one child, but for all our descendants who would value what we sacrificed to build. I cannot stand by and watch your parents destroy the principles of fairness and merit that guided every decision Miguel and I made." Mr. Burke watched my face carefully as I absorbed my grandmother's words. "Miss Martinez, your grandmother was quite concerned about your parents' financial decisions regarding your sister. She came to me several times in her final year, worried that the family business would be mismanaged if left entirely in Amanda's hands." I looked up from the letter, my heart pounding. "What exactly are you telling me?" He slid another document across the table, this one bearing official legal seals and signatures. "Your grandmother created a separate will, unknown to your parents, leaving her personal assets and her 51% ownership stake in Martinez Construction Company directly to you." The words hit me like lightning. 51%. That meant controlling interest. That meant my grandmother had never actually signed over complete ownership to my parents the way everyone believed. She'd retained majority control and left it to me. "I don't understand," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "My parents run the business. They've been making all the decisions for years." Mr. Burke nodded grimly. "Your grandmother allowed them to operate as if they owned it outright, but legally she maintained control until her death. She never told them about this arrangement because she wanted to observe how they handled family matters before making her final decision. Based on what she witnessed, particularly their treatment of you versus Amanda, she chose to ensure the business would be protected." I stared at the legal documents, the official language blurring as tears filled my eyes. My grandmother had been watching, had seen what I thought I was imagining, had cared enough to take action. The woman who taught me to balance checkbooks during summer visits, who'd praised my business sense and encouraged my education, had left me the means to protect everything she and my grandfather had built.
There's more, Mr. Burke continued, producing additional paperwork. Your grandmother also maintained several investment accounts and owned 3 rental properties in older Phoenix neighborhoods. The total value of her estate, including her share of the business, comes to approximately $2.8 million. My mouth fell open. $2.8 million. More money than I'd ever imagined having. Enough to pay off my student loans, buy a house, start my own business if I wanted. But more than the money was what it represented. Validation that someone in my family had seen my worth, had believed in me enough to entrust me with their life's work. Why didn't she tell anyone about this? I asked, still trying to process the magnitude of what I was learning. She wanted to protect you, Mr. Burke explained. Rosa was concerned that if your parents knew about her intentions, they might pressure her to change her mind or make your life more difficult. She also wanted to see if their behavior would improve over time. Unfortunately, it appears to have gotten worse. I thought about last night's dinner, about my parents' casual dismissal of my worth, about their certainty that I deserved nothing, while Amanda deserved everything. If only they'd known what Rosa was planning, would they have treated me differently? Or would they have found ways to undermine my grandmother's wishes? What happens now? I asked, my practical mind starting to engage despite the emotional whirlwind. Now we execute your grandmother's will, Mr. Burke said simply, which means informing your parents that they do not in fact own the business they've been operating. It also means you'll need to decide how you want to handle your new position as majority owner. The implications were staggering. My parents had just announced their intention to leave everything to Amanda, not realizing they didn't actually own everything to begin with. They'd built their retirement plans and Amanda's future around assets that weren't entirely theirs. And I, the daughter they deemed unworthy of inheritance, was about to become their boss. Do they have any legal claim to challenge this? I asked, the MBA program finally proving useful in helping me think strategically. None whatsoever, Mr. Burke assured me. Your grandmother's will is ironclad, properly witnessed and filed with the appropriate authorities. Your parents were always employees of the business, not owners, regardless of what they believed. Rosa simply allowed them to operate with full autonomy while she was alive. I spent the next hour reviewing documents, signing papers, and trying to comprehend the dramatic shift in my circumstances. When I finally left Burke & Associates, I carried copies of everything in a manila envelope that felt like 1,000 pounds. My grandmother's letter was tucked inside my purse, her words echoing in my mind as I drove through downtown Phoenix traffic. That evening, I sat in my tiny apartment surrounded by legal documents and financial statements, trying to calculate not just the monetary value of my inheritance, but its emotional significance. For 28 years, I'd felt like an outsider in my own family, working twice as hard for half the recognition. Now I discovered that the person whose opinion had mattered most to me had been quietly arranging to validate everything I'd hoped to prove. I called Tyler, needing to share this revelation with someone who understood the family dynamics. "You're kidding me," he said after I'd explained everything. "Your grandmother left you controlling interest in the business? The same business your parents just announced they're leaving to Amanda?" 51%, I confirmed, still barely believing it myself. Plus, rental properties and investment accounts. Tyler, she left me almost $3 million. There was silence on the other end of the line as Tyler processed this information. As a lawyer himself, he understood the legal implications better than most people would. "Jessica, this changes everything," he said finally. "Your parents can't leave Amanda a business they don't actually own. And if you're the majority shareholder, you have final say over all major decisions." The power dynamic in my family had just flipped completely upside down. Yesterday, I was the disposable daughter, too independent to deserve their support. Today, I was the person who could decide whether my parents kept their jobs, whether Amanda's promised inheritance had any substance, whether the family business continued operating under their management or took a completely different direction.
"What are you going to do?" Tyler asked. It was the question I'd been avoiding since leaving Burke and Associates. What was I going to do? The responsible thing would be to tell my parents immediately, to have an honest conversation about the business and work out an arrangement that honored both my grandmother's wishes.
And their decades of labor. But after last night's dinner, after years of being dismissed and devalued, the responsible thing felt less appealing than it might have under different circumstances. I don't know yet, I admitted. I need time to think, to figure out what Rosa really wanted me to do with this. Over the next several days, I found myself thinking constantly about my grandmother's motivations. She could have simply left me money, could have given me enough to be comfortable without disrupting the family business. Instead, she'd chosen to give me control, to put me in a position where I'd have to make decisions that would affect everyone. It felt like a test, like she was asking me to prove I deserved the trust she'd placed in me. I began researching Martinez Construction Company's financials, using my business school training to analyze the company's performance under my parents' management. What I discovered was both impressive and concerning. The business was profitable and growing, testament to my parents' operational skills, but it was also heavily leveraged and dependent on a few major clients. My father's expansion plans were aggressive, requiring significant capital investment that could pay off spectacularly or bankrupt the company if the construction market shifted. More troubling was Amanda's role in the organization. Her personnel file, which I now had access to as majority owner, revealed a pattern of attendance problems, customer complaints, and costly mistakes that had been quietly covered up. She was drawing a project manager salary while performing at an entry-level standard, and several long-term employees had complained about her attitude and competence. Meanwhile, my parents continued operating as if nothing had changed. My father called twice during the week to share unsolicited advice about my career prospects, suggesting I consider working for other construction companies where my MBA might be more appreciated. The irony would have been laughable if it hadn't been so painful. I also began spending time at my grandmother's house, which I now owned along with everything else she'd left me. The modest ranch home in an older Phoenix neighborhood felt like a time capsule, filled with photographs and mementos from her life with my grandfather. In her bedroom closet, I found boxes of business documents dating back to the company's founding, detailed records of every major decision and investment. Rosa had been meticulous in her record keeping, and as I read through decades of correspondence and financial reports, I began to understand the true scope of what she and Miguel had built. Martinez Construction hadn't started as the luxury home builder it was today. They'd begun with small repairs and renovations, working nights and weekends while Miguel kept his day job at a factory and Rosa cleaned houses to make ends meet. Every dollar had been earned through sacrifice, every expansion carefully planned and funded through years of saving. They'd built something sustainable and ethical, treating employees fairly and maintaining quality standards, even when cutting corners might have increased profits. The company's reputation for integrity had been their greatest asset, more valuable than any contract or client relationship. But my parents' management style was different. They'd grown comfortable with the success Rosa and Miguel had created, less careful about maintaining the relationships and principles that had built it. Several former employees had left over the past few years, citing concerns about the company's direction. And now they were planning to hand control to Amanda, who had never demonstrated any understanding or appreciation for the business's history and values. By the end of the week, I'd made my decision about how to handle my inheritance, though I hadn't yet figured out the timing. I would claim my rightful position as majority owner, but I would do it strategically, at a moment when the revelation would have maximum impact. My parents had chosen to announce their inheritance plans at a family dinner, making a public declaration of my worthlessness. It seemed fitting that they should learn about their mistake in an equally public setting. The more I learned about my grandmother's true feelings and intentions, the more I understood that this wasn't just about business ownership or family money. Rosa had left me the tools to restore balance to a family dynamic that had become dangerously skewed. She'd seen what my parents couldn't or wouldn't see, that enabling Amanda's irresponsibility while punishing my competence was destroying both of her granddaughters in different ways. Amanda had never been challenged to develop real skills or independence because everything had always been handed to her. Meanwhile, I'd been forced to prove myself constantly while receiving no acknowledgement for my efforts. Rosa's inheritance was designed to force a reckoning, to make everyone in the family confront the consequences of years of unequal treatment. As I sat in her living room, surrounded by photos of family gatherings where everyone looked genuinely happy, I felt a deep connection to the woman who'd shaped so much of my character. Rosa had taught me about hard work and persistence, about treating people fairly and standing up for what was right. Now she was asking me to apply those lessons to the most challenging situation I'd ever faced. The weight of that responsibility was enormous, but so was the opportunity. For the first time in my life, I had the power to demand the respect I'd always deserved, to protect the legacy Rosa and Miguel had built, and to show my family that their treatment of me had consequences they'd never anticipated. My phone buzzed with another text from my mother, this one announcing that Amanda and Kevin were planning a celebration party for their inheritance windfall. "You should come," she wrote. "It would mean a lot to Amanda if you could be happy for her." I stared at the message for a long moment before typing back a simple response. "I'll be there." It was time to show them exactly what Rosa really wanted for this family. Amanda's celebration party was scheduled for Saturday night at her Paradise Valley mansion, the same house my parents had helped finance with that $500,000 gift. The invitation, delivered via a professionally printed card that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, promised an evening of gratitude and family togetherness. The irony was so thick I could have cut it with a knife. I spent Friday evening at Tyler's apartment, helping him review contracts for his law practice, while I wrestled with the timing of my revelation. Tyler had become my unofficial advisor in this situation, his legal expertise invaluable as I navigated the complexities of my newfound position. "You could wait," he suggested as we sat on his couch.
Legal documents spread across his coffee table. Take time to fully understand the business operations before you make any major moves. I shook my head, fingering the copy of Rosa's will that I'd been carrying everywhere since my meeting with Mr. Burke. No, they've already started planning Amanda's future based on assets they don't own. Every day I wait makes it worse when the truth comes out. Tyler nodded, understanding the psychological warfare that had defined my family relationships for years. Just remember, once you do this, there's no going back. Your relationship with your parents will never be the same. "It was never really a relationship to begin with," I replied, surprised by the bitterness in my own voice. "At least this way, I'll finally know where I stand." Saturday morning, I drove to Rosa's house to spend some quiet time in the space that now belonged to me. The neighborhood was older but well-maintained, full of modest ranch homes with mature landscaping and the kind of community feel that newer developments lacked. Rosa's house sat on a corner lot with a large backyard where she'd grown vegetables and flowers until arthritis made gardening too difficult. Inside, I found myself drawn to her bedroom, where I'd discovered those boxes of business documents. Today, I noticed something I'd missed before: a small wooden jewelry box on her dresser, carved with intricate patterns that suggested it had been a treasured possession. When I opened it, I found not jewelry, but more letters, these addressed to various family members and dated years apart. The letter addressed to my parents was dated 5 years ago, during one of their particularly egregious displays of favoritism. Rosa had written pages of careful observations about their treatment of Amanda and me, expressing her disappointment in language that was both diplomatic and devastating. She'd never sent the letter, but keeping it suggested she'd been documenting their behavior for years, building a case for the decisions she would eventually make. There was also a letter addressed to Amanda, written just a year before Rosa's death. In it, my grandmother expressed love for her older granddaughter while gently but firmly pointing out the consequences of never facing real challenges or developing genuine skills. Rosa had recognized that Amanda was as much a victim of my parents' misguided favoritism as I was, trapped in a cycle of dependency that prevented her from growing into her full potential. "You have intelligence and creativity, mija," Rosa had written, "but you have never been required to use them. Your parents think they are helping you by making life easy, but they are stealing your chance to become strong." The final letter was addressed to me, separate from the one Mr. Burke had shown me.
This one was more personal, filled with memories of our time together and expressions of pride in my accomplishments that my parents had never bothered to acknowledge. "You remind me of myself at your age," Rosa had written, "determined to prove that you deserve a place in this world. But you already deserve it, Jessica. You always have. I'm giving you these tools not because you need to earn them, but because you have already earned them many times over." Reading her words in the house where she'd lived and loved and planned for our family's future, I felt a deep sense of connection to something larger than the immediate drama. Rosa had understood that families were built on more than blood relationships, that they required intention and fairness and the willingness to make difficult decisions when love alone wasn't enough. I spent the afternoon walking through the house, imagining what I might do with it. The location was perfect for someone starting a career in Phoenix, close enough to downtown for business meetings, but far enough for my parents to maintain healthy boundaries. I could picture myself living here, hosting dinners for friends, like Tyler, creating the kind of warm, welcoming environment that Rosa had always maintained. But first, I had to get through tonight's party and the conversation that would change everything. I arrived at Amanda's house fashionably late, my car looking distinctly out of place among the luxury vehicles filling the circular driveway. The mansion was a testament to excess, all soaring ceilings and marble surfaces designed to impress rather than comfort. Through the large windows, I could see the party already in full swing, my parents holding court near the elaborate bar while Amanda and Kevin mingled with guests I didn't recognize. The gathering was larger than I expected, maybe 40 people, including extended family, business associates, and what appeared to be several of Amanda and Kevin's country club friends. Everyone was dressed in the kind of casual elegance that cost more than most people's formal wear, their conversations punctuated by laughter that carried the particular cadence of people who'd never worried about money. I made my way through the crowd, accepting congratulatory comments about Amanda's good fortune with polite smiles that felt increasingly artificial. Several people mentioned how generous my parents were being, how lucky Amanda was to have such supportive family. If only they knew the full story. My cousin Maria, my father's niece, cornered me near the elaborate buffet spread that probably cost more than my monthly rent. "So, what's next for you, Jess?" she asked, her tone suggesting she'd already heard about my exclusion from the family inheritance. "Your parents mentioned you're finishing school soon." "Something like that," I replied, keeping my response deliberately vague. Maria had always been closer to Amanda, drawn to her glamorous lifestyle and casual attitude towards responsibility. She'd never shown much interest in my academic achievements or career plans. "Well, I'm sure you'll figure something out," Maria said with the kind of dismissive optimism reserved for people whose problems seem manageable from a distance. "You've always been so independent." That word again, independent, as if choosing to work for what I wanted was a character flaw rather than a virtue, as if needing my parents' support would have been preferable to building my own capabilities. I excused myself and found a quiet corner where I could observe the celebration without having to participate in conversations that made my teeth ache. Amanda was glowing as she accepted congratulations, her happiness genuine, if her understanding of the situation was completely wrong. Kevin stood beside her like a peacock, his chest puffed with pride over good fortune he did nothing to earn. My parents were in their element, basking in the praise for their generous decision to leave everything to Amanda. My father was explaining to anyone who would listen how Amanda's creative spirit and natural leadership abilities made her the obvious choice to carry on the family legacy.
Mother nodded along, adding comments about how I was too focused on academics to appreciate the family business. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. They were celebrating their decision to exclude me from inheritance of a business I now actually owned, praising Amanda's qualifications for managing assets that weren't theirs to give. Every word they spoke made my grandmother's decision seem more prescient, more necessary. As the evening wore on, I found myself thinking about the employees at Martinez Construction, the people whose livelihoods depended on the company's continued success. Under my parents' management, the business had grown but become increasingly unstable, dependent on high-risk projects and expensive expansion plans. Amanda's involvement had already caused problems with several major clients, her lack of professionalism creating tensions that my father had smoothed over through personal relationships. If my parents followed through on their plan to leave Amanda in charge, how long would it take for the business to suffer irreparable damage? How many jobs would be lost when clients decided they couldn't work with someone who treated multi-million-dollar projects like casual hobbies? How many of the principles Rosa and Miguel had established would be abandoned in favor of short-term profits? Around 10 o'clock, my father called for everyone's attention, tapping his wine glass with a silver spoon to quiet the crowd. The gesture was theatrical, designed to maximize the dramatic impact of whatever announcement he was planning to make. Friends, family, thank you all for being here tonight to celebrate with Amanda and Kevin, he began, his voice carrying easily across the large living room. As most of you know, Linda and I have made the decision to leave our family business and assets to Amanda when we're gone. A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd, people nodding and smiling as if they were witnessing something heartwarming rather than the culmination of decades of unfair treatment. Some people might question leaving everything to one child, my father continued, his eyes briefly meeting mine across the room. But Linda and I believe in giving our support where it's most needed. Amanda has the heart and vision to carry Martinez Construction into the future, while Jessica has always been determined to make her own way in the world. More approving murmurs, as if my determination to be self-sufficient was evidence of my unsuitability for family support rather than proof of my character. The crowd was eating up this narrative of generous parents making thoughtful decisions based on their children's different needs and capabilities. Amanda stepped forward, tears already forming in her eyes as she prepared to deliver what was clearly a prepared speech about gratitude and family love. This was the moment I had been waiting for, the perfect setup for the revelation that would shatter their carefully constructed story. I stood up, my movement catching my father's attention as he prepared to hand the microphone to Amanda. Actually, Dad, before Amanda speaks, there's something everyone should know, I said, my voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet room. My father's expression shifted from confused to annoyed, clearly displeased by my interruption of his carefully orchestrated moment. Jessica, this isn't really the time for... It's exactly the time, I interrupted, reaching into my purse and withdrawing the copies of Rosa's will and the business ownership documents. Especially since you're making announcements about assets you don't actually own. The silence that followed was deafening. 40 people stared at me as I walked toward the center of the room, documents in hand, my heart pounding, but my voice steady. 6 months ago, when Grandma Rosa died, we all thought my parents inherited full ownership of Martinez Construction Company. But it turns out Rosa had other plans. I held up the documents, their official seals and legal language clearly visible even from a distance. Rosa never actually transferred full ownership to my parents. She retained 51% controlling interest in the business and left it directly to me, along with several properties and investment accounts totaling $2.8 million. The room erupted in gasps and whispered conversations as people processed what I'd just revealed. My parents stood frozen, their faces cycling through confusion, disbelief, and growing horror as the implications became clear. "That's impossible," my father said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mother signed everything over to us years ago." "Apparently not," I replied, walking over to hand him the legal documents. "According to Burke & Associates, Rosa wanted to observe how you handled family matters before making her final decision about the business succession. Based on what she witnessed, she chose to ensure the company would be protected." My mother grabbed the papers from my father's hands, her eyes scanning the legal language with increasing desperation. "This can't be legal. We've been running that business for 20 years. "As employees," I clarified. "Very well compensated employees, with significant autonomy, but employees nonetheless. Rosa allowed you to operate as if you owned the company, but she never actually gave up control."
Amanda had gone pale, her celebration speech forgotten as she struggled to understand what was happening. But they promised me everything. They said I was inheriting the business. They can't leave you something they don't own, I explained, feeling a mixture of triumph and sadness as I watched her world collapse. And according to these documents, I now have final say over all major business decisions, including personnel and succession planning. The crowd had gone completely silent, everyone staring at our family drama like spectators at a car accident. My parents' business associates were undoubtedly calculating the implications for their own relationships with Martinez Construction, while the extended family tried to process this dramatic reversal of fortune. Kevin found his voice first, his face red with anger and embarrassment. This is ridiculous. You can't just show up and claim ownership of a business you've never worked for. Actually, I can, I replied calmly, because I'm not claiming ownership, I'm accepting inheritance. There's a significant difference. My father had been reading through the documents, his expression growing more stricken with each page. As a businessman, he understood legal language well enough to recognize that these papers were legitimate and comprehensive. Jessica, he said finally, his voice hoarse with shock, we need to discuss this privately. This isn't the place for family business. You made it the place when
You decided to announce my disinheritance at a public celebration, I replied. I'm simply correcting the record. The party was clearly over, guests beginning to collect their belongings and make awkward excuses for early departures. No one wanted to be present for the family meltdown that was obviously coming, and I didn't blame them. This was about to get very ugly very quickly. As people filed out, offering stilted congratulations to Amanda and confused goodbyes to my parents, I found myself standing alone in the center of the room that had been designed to showcase wealth and success. Now it felt like a stage set after the curtain had fallen, all artifice and empty grandeur. Tyler had been right about one thing. There was no going back from this moment. I'd just publicly destroyed my parents' retirement plans, shattered Amanda's expectations, and claimed my place as the person who would determine the future of everything they thought they'd built. But I'd also honored my grandmother's trust, protected the legacy she and Miguel had created, and finally demanded the respect I'd been denied my entire life. For the first time in 28 years, I wasn't asking for my family's approval or acceptance. I was taking what was rightfully mine. The aftermath of my revelation unfolded over the following weeks like a slow-motion explosion, each family member processing the truth at their own pace and in their own destructive way. Amanda locked herself in her bedroom for 3 days, emerging only to scream at Kevin when he suggested they needed to start planning for a very different financial future. My parents alternated between denial, rage, and desperate attempts to find legal loopholes that might invalidate Rose's will. The first confrontation came Tuesday morning, when my father showed up at my apartment, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled, and his eyes red with sleepless fury. I'd been expecting this visit, had actually wondered what had taken him so long to work up the courage for a direct attack. You destroyed your sister's life, he said, the moment I opened the door, not bothering with pleasantries or invitations inside. 20 years we've been building toward this moment, planning Amanda's future, and you ruined it with some legal technicality your grandmother cooked up behind our backs. I stepped aside to let him enter, knowing this conversation needed to happen, but dreading every moment of it. My tiny apartment felt even smaller, with his angry presence filling the space, his expensive cologne clashing with the modest surroundings I'd grown comfortable with. It's not a technicality, Dad. It's ownership. Rosa never gave you the business. She just let you run it. I kept my voice level, drawing on every meditation technique and stress management strategy I'd learned during my MBA program. She spent years watching how you treated Amanda and me, and she made her decision based on what she observed. His face reddened, the controlled businessman facade cracking to reveal the entitled anger underneath. Your grandmother was a bitter old woman who never understood how difficult it is to raise children in the modern world. Amanda needed our support, needed encouragement, needed to know she was valued. And I didn't?
The question came out sharper than I had intended. Years of suppressed hurt bleeding through my professional composure. I needed support too, Dad. I needed encouragement too. But instead, you punished me for being capable and rewarded her for being helpless. He waved his hand dismissively, the same gesture he'd used my entire life when my feelings became inconvenient. You never needed help the way Amanda did. You were always so determined, so focused. We knew you'd be fine on your own. There it was again, that twisted logic that turned my strengths into justification for their neglect, as if success was punishment, as if competence meant I deserved less love and support than someone who couldn't function without constant assistance. "Do you hear yourself?" I asked, genuinely curious about the mental gymnastics required to maintain such a worldview. "You're telling me that being responsible and hardworking meant I deserved to be excluded from my own family's legacy?" "You excluded yourself," he shot back, his voice rising with each word. "Always so judgmental, always looking down on Amanda because she wasn't as driven as you were. You made yourself an outsider, Jessica. We just accepted what you clearly wanted." The gaslighting was so blatant, so perfectly executed that I almost admired its audacity. In his version of events, my disappointment with their favoritism had caused the favoritism. My desire for equal treatment had justified unequal treatment. My hurt at being overlooked had somehow forced them to overlook me. I was 8 years old when this pattern started. 8! What exactly did I do at 8 to exclude myself from family love? He had no answer for that, just stood there breathing heavily like a man who'd run a marathon instead of a father who had spent decades emotionally abandoning his younger daughter. The silence stretched between us, filled with years of unspoken resentments and willful misunderstandings. "Give us the business back," he said finally, his tone shifting from anger to pleading. "We built it into what it is today. We have employees depending on us, contracts to fulfill, obligations to meet. You can't just waltz in and destroy everything we've worked for." "I'm not destroying anything," I replied. "I'm protecting it. Rosa left detailed notes about her concerns regarding the company's direction, about Amanda's performance issues, about the risks you're taking with aggressive expansion. She was worried you were going to ruin what she and Miguel built." The truth is that I'd spent the past week conducting my own analysis of Martinez Construction's operations, using my MBA training to evaluate everything from cash flow to client satisfaction rates. What I'd discovered had validated every concern my grandmother had expressed in her private letters. The business was profitable, but unstable, dependent on a handful of major clients who were growing increasingly frustrated with service issues. Amanda's involvement in client relations had resulted in 3 formal complaints in the past year, problems that my father had smoothed over through personal relations rather than addressing the underlying performance issues. The company's reputation for quality and reliability, built over decades of careful work, was eroding under management that prioritized growth over excellence. "Amanda could learn," my father insisted, though his tone suggested he didn't believe it himself. "She's 32 years old," I pointed out. "How much more time does she need? How much more training can you provide to someone who doesn't want to be trained?"
Want to learn? How much more support can you give someone who's never been required to stand on her own? He didn't answer, just stared out my small window at the parking lot where his luxury car sat next to my ancient Honda Civic. The visual metaphor was perfect. His wealth and status next to my modest reality. His comfort next to my struggle. His assumptions about what each of us deserved. "We'll fight this," he said finally, his voice quiet but determined. "We'll challenge the will. Find lawyers who can prove your grandmother wasn't competent when she made these decisions." "Good luck with that," I replied, genuinely unconcerned about his threats. Burke and Associates has handled the Martinez family legal affairs for 30 years. They have extensive documentation of Rosa's mental competence, multiple witnesses to her decision-making process, and ironclad legal protections for her choices. The defeat in his shoulders was visible as the reality of his situation finally sank in. He'd spent 20 years believing he owned something that had never been his, making plans based on assets he'd never controlled, promising his elder daughter a future he had no legal right to provide. "What do you want from us?" he asked, the question carrying the weight of a man who just realized his entire worldview was built on false assumptions. It was a fair question, and one I'd been grappling with since the night of Amanda's party. What did I want? Revenge would have been satisfying, but ultimately destructive. Complete control would have given me power, but isolated me from any possibility of family reconciliation. What I really wanted was something my parents had never been able to give me: acknowledgement of my worth and respect for my capabilities. "I want you to stay on as general manager," I said, watching his surprise at my measured response. "You're good at running the day-to-day operations. You know the clients and suppliers. You understand the local market. But I want Amanda removed from any client-facing role, and I want final approval on all major financial decisions." He stared at me for a long moment, processing this unexpected offer of partnership rather than punishment. "And Amanda, what happens to her position in the company?" "She can stay if she's willing to start at the bottom and work her way up like everyone else," I said. "No special treatment, no management responsibilities she hasn't earned, no salary she hasn't justified through performance. If she wants to be part of the family business, she needs to prove she deserves to be there." The conditions were fair but firm, designed to protect the business while giving my family members the opportunity to earn their places through merit rather than birth order. My father's expression suggested he understood both the generosity and the non-negotiability of what I was offering. "I need to discuss this with my mother and Amanda," he said, his businessman instincts engaging as he considered the practical implications of my proposal. "Take all the time you need," I replied, "but understand that this offer has an expiration date. I'm perfectly capable of finding new management if the current team isn't interested in working under these conditions." After he left, I felt emotionally drained, but strangely liberated. The conversation I'd been dreading my entire adult life was finally over, and it had gone better than I had expected. My father had been forced to confront the reality of his choices, to see the consequences of decades of favoritism and entitlement. Whether he chose to learn from that confrontation or continue fighting against it was his decision to make. The next few days brought a parade of family members seeking audiences with me, each trying to understand their place in this new reality. My mother arrived with Amanda in tow, both of them red-eyed from crying and clearly hoping that feminine solidarity might succeed where masculine confrontation had failed. "Jessica, honey, we need to talk about this whole situation," my mother began, settling herself on my threadbare couch like a diplomat negotiating a ceasefire. "I think there's been a misunderstanding about your father's announcement at dinner." I almost laughed at her attempt to reframe their complete disinheritance of me as a simple miscommunication. What kind of misunderstanding? "Well, when he said we were leaving everything to Amanda, he didn't mean we were excluding you entirely," she continued, her voice taking on the carefully modulated tone she used when trying to manage family conflicts. "We just thought she needed more support than you did." Amanda nodded eagerly, seizing on this revised narrative like a lifeline. "That's right, Jess. We never wanted to hurt you. We just thought you were so successful, so independent, that you didn't need help the way I did." The cognitive dissonance was breathtaking. They were sitting in my tiny apartment, looking at my secondhand furniture and discount store decorations, talking about how successful and independent I was, as if success meant living paycheck to paycheck while working multiple jobs to pay for school. As if independence meant having no family support while watching my sister receive hundreds of thousands of dollars for existing. "Let me understand this correctly," I said, keeping my voice patient despite my growing irritation. "You announced at a public dinner that I was getting nothing from your estate because I was too independent to need help. but now you're telling me that wasn't actually what you meant? My mother's discomfort was visible as she struggled to reconcile their public statements with their current damage control efforts. We may have phrased things poorly in the heat of the moment. The heat of what moment? I asked. You'd clearly planned that announcement. You'd already had lawyers draw up new wills. You'd made a deliberate, considered decision to exclude me completely, and now you're trying to pretend it was some kind of miscommunication? Amanda burst into tears, her carefully applied makeup running in black streaks down her cheeks. I never asked them to exclude you. I never wanted this to happen. I just wanted them to help me because I'm not as smart as you are, not as capable as you are. There was genuine distress in her voice, and for a moment I felt sympathy for the woman who'd been as damaged by our parents' favoritism as I had been, just in different ways. She'd never been challenged to develop real competence because everything had always been handed to her. She'd never learned to value her own capabilities because she'd never been required to develop any. Amanda, you're 32 years old. You're perfectly capable of learning new skills, developing competence, building a life you can be proud of. But you can't do that as long as mom and dad keep treating you like a helpless child who needs constant rescue. But I do need help.
Wailed. I don't know how to do the things you do. I don't know how to budget money or negotiate contracts or manage employees. I never learned how to be strong like you. Because you were never required to learn, I pointed out. Every time you faced a challenge, mom and dad solved it for you. Every time you made a mistake, they fixed it. Every time you needed something, they provided it. How were you supposed to develop strength when you were never allowed to exercise it? My mother shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the truth in what I was saying, but unwilling to acknowledge her role in creating the situation. We just wanted to protect her, she said defensively. We wanted both our daughters to be happy. You can't protect someone from life indefinitely, I replied, and you can't make someone happy by preventing them from developing the skills they need to create their own happiness. The conversation continued for another hour, covering the same ground repeatedly as my mother and Amanda tried various approaches to convince me to restore the status quo. They offered compromises that weren't really compromises, apologies that didn't acknowledge wrongdoing, and promises of future fairness that rang hollow given their past behavior. When they finally left, I felt exhausted, but oddly hopeful. For the first time in my adult life, my family had been forced to confront the reality of their choices and their consequences. Whether they learned from that confrontation remained to be seen, but at least the conversation was finally happening. Over the following weeks, I threw myself into learning everything I could about Martinez Construction Company's operations. I visited job sites, reviewed contracts, interviewed employees, and analyzed financial records with the thoroughness my MBA training had taught me. What I discovered was a business with tremendous potential that was being held back by poor management decisions and internal politics. The company's founding principles of quality work and fair treatment had gradually been eroded under my parents' leadership. Several long-term employees expressed frustration with recent changes in company culture, citing pressure to cut corners and rush projects in ways that compromised their craftsmanship. Others mentioned concerns about Amanda's involvement in project management, describing instances where her lack of knowledge had created expensive problems. But there were also bright spots. The company's reputation in the Phoenix construction market was still strong, built on decades of reliable work. Several major clients expressed interest in continuing their relationships under new management, and the skilled workforce that Rosa and Miguel had assembled over the years remained largely intact, waiting for leadership that would let them do their best work. I began developing a comprehensive plan for the company's future, one that honored my grandparents' founding principles while adapting to modern market conditions. It would require significant changes in management structure, quality control processes, and employee relations, but the foundation was solid enough to support ambitious growth if handled correctly. The plan also included specific roles for my parents and Amanda, contingent on their willingness to accept new terms of employment. My father would remain as operations manager, responsible for day-to-day project supervision and client relations.
My mother could continue handling administrative functions, though with reduced authority over major financial decisions. And Amanda would be offered an entry-level position in project coordination, with opportunities for advancement based on performance rather than family connections. Tyler helped me refine the legal structure of these arrangements, ensuring that my controlling interest in the business was protected, while providing clear expectations and consequences for all employees, family or otherwise. The contracts we drafted were firm but fair, designed to prevent future conflicts while giving everyone the opportunity to succeed if they were willing to work for it. 6 weeks after the revelation at Amanda's party, I called a family meeting at Rosa's house, the home that now belonged to me and represented everything my grandmother had worked to preserve. I'd chosen the location deliberately, wanting the conversation to take place in the space where Rosa had made her final decisions about our family's future. Everyone arrived looking nervous and uncertain, clearly unsure what to expect from this formal gathering. We sat around Rosa's dining room table, the same table where she'd served countless family meals and where I'd learned to balance checkbooks during childhood visits. I've spent the past month analyzing the business and developing a plan for its future, I began, distributing copies of the comprehensive proposal I'd prepared. These documents outline my expectations for company operations, management structure, and employee responsibilities going forward. My parents read through the materials with the careful attention of people whose livelihoods depended on understanding every detail. Amanda struggled with some of the business terminology, but seemed to grasp the basic concepts. Kevin, who had no official role in the company, sat quietly beside his wife, looking uncomfortable with his sudden irrelevance to family financial planning. "These terms are reasonable," my father admitted after reviewing the entire proposal. "More generous than I expected, given everything that's happened. I'm not interested in punishment. I'm interested in protecting what Rosa and Miguel built while giving everyone the opportunity to earn their place in its future." Amanda looked up from her copy with tears in her eyes. "You're really going to let me stay, even after everything that's happened?" "If you're willing to start over and prove yourself," I confirmed. "No special treatment, no shortcuts, no protection from the consequences of poor performance. But if you're willing to work for it, there's a place for you here." She nodded eagerly, perhaps understanding for the first time that earned success might be more satisfying than inherited privilege. My mother reached across the table to squeeze my hand, a gesture of gratitude that carried more emotional weight than any of her previous attempts at reconciliation. "What about the other properties?" my father asked, referring to the rental houses Rosa had left me. "What are your plans for those?" "I'm keeping them," I said simply. "They're part of my inheritance, separate from the business. I'll probably hire a property management company to handle the day-to-day operations while I focus on learning to run Martinez construction." The meeting continued for another 2 hours as we worked through the practical details of the transition. Employment contracts were signed, reporting structures were established, and performance expectations were clearly defined. By the time everyone left, we had a framework for moving forward that acknowledged both the past's mistakes and the future's possibilities. 3 months later, I was sitting in the office that had once belonged to my grandfather Miguel, reviewing quarterly financial reports that showed steady improvement in both profitability and client satisfaction. The changes I'd implemented were working, slowly but surely transforming Martinez Construction back into the kind of company Rosa and Miguel had originally envisioned. Amanda had surprised everyone, including herself, by throwing herself into her entry-level position with unexpected enthusiasm. Freed from the pressure of living up to artificially high expectations, she discovered she actually enjoyed the problem-solving aspects of construction project coordination. She was still learning, still making mistakes, but for the first time in her life, she was developing real competence through real effort. My parents had adapted to their new roles with varying degrees of grace. My father remained an excellent operations manager when he wasn't trying to make decisions above his authority level. My mother had initially resented her reduced influence, but gradually came to appreciate the reduced stress that came with clear boundaries and defined responsibilities. The family dynamics were still complicated, probably always would be, but they were honest now in ways they'd never been before. We no longer pretended that everyone was treated equally or that past hurts didn't matter. Instead, we acknowledged the damage that had been done while working to build something better from the pieces that remained. Tyler stopped by the office one Friday evening, bringing Chinese takeout and legal documents for a new property acquisition I was considering. We sat in Rose's old office, surrounded by photos of construction projects spanning 5 decades, eating lo mein from cardboard containers while reviewing contracts. "Any regrets?" he asked, gesturing around the office that represented my transformed life. I considered the question seriously, thinking about the path that had brought me here. 6 months ago, I'd been a struggling graduate student with crushing debt and no family support. Today, I was the owner of a successful business, multiple properties, and more money than I'd ever imagined having. But more importantly, I'd finally claimed my place in my family and demanded the respect I'd always deserved. "None," I said, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. Rosa knew what she was doing when she left me these responsibilities. She knew I'd protect what she and Miguel built while giving everyone else the chance to prove they deserved to be part of it. Tyler smiled, recognizing the piece in my voice that had been missing for as long as he'd known me. "Your grandmother would be proud." I looked at the photo on the desk, Rosa and Miguel standing in front of the company's first office building, their faces bright with the pride of people who'd built something lasting through their own efforts. They'd understood that real love sometimes required difficult decisions, that protecting someone often meant challenging them rather than enabling them. "Yeah," I said, touching the frame gently. "I think she would be." As the sun set over Phoenix, casting long shadows through the office windows, I felt the deep satisfaction of work well done and responsibilities properly honored. I'd inherited more than money and property from my grandmother. I'd inherited her values, her strength, and her understanding that families were built through choices rather than accidents of birth. My parents had chosen favoritism over fairness, enabling over empowerment, comfort over growth. Rosa had chosen differently, and in doing so, she'd given me the tools to choose differently too. The result wasn't perfect, might never be perfect, but it was honest and earned and mine. For the first time in 28 years, that was enough. 6 months after claiming my inheritance, I was standing in the lobby of the newly renovated Martinez Construction headquarters, watching workers install a bronze plaque that read, "Founded by Rosa and Miguel Martinez, 1987, built on excellence, integrity, and family values." The building itself had undergone a complete transformation under my ownership, shifting from the sterile corporate aesthetic my parents had favored to something that honored our family's immigrant roots while projecting modern professionalism. The changes weren't just cosmetic. Every aspect of the business had been restructured to reflect the principles my grandparents had established, but my parents had gradually abandoned. Quality control processes had been reinstated, employee profit-sharing programs had been implemented, and client satisfaction ratings had climbed to their highest levels in over a decade. The company that Rosa had entrusted to me was finally operating the way she and Miguel had always intended. Amanda walked through the lobby carrying a stack of project files, her appearance dramatically different from the pampered socialite who'd celebrated her expected inheritance months earlier. Gone were the designer clothes and perfectly styled hair, replaced with practical work attire and the slightly harried look of someone learning to manage multiple responsibilities. She'd thrown herself into her entry-level position with an intensity that had surprised everyone, including herself. "Jessica, the Carefree project team needs approval on the material upgrades," she said, approaching my office with the confidence of someone who'd finally found her footing in a professional environment. "The clients want to switch to imported marble, but it'll push us over budget unless we adjust the timeline." I reviewed the proposal she'd prepared, noting the thoroughness of her cost analysis and the practical alternatives she'd identified. 6 months ago, Amanda couldn't have written a coherent email about construction materials. Now, she was managing complex projects and making recommendations that demonstrated genuine understanding of the business. "What's your recommendation?" I asked, curious to hear her assessment. "I think we should present them with 3 options," she replied, pulling out a detailed comparison chart she'd created. Standard materials on schedule, premium materials with a 2-week delay, or a hybrid approach that gives them the marble in the main areas while using quality alternatives in less visible spaces. The analysis was solid, showing Amanda had developed real competence through months of consistent effort and learning from her mistakes. My parents had done her no favors by shielding her from challenges, but she'd proven capable of growth when given proper structure and expectations. Excellent work, I said, approving her recommendation. Set up a meeting with the clients to present these options.
And Amanda, take the lead on that presentation. You know this project better than anyone. Her face lit up with pride, the genuine satisfaction of someone who'd earned recognition through merit rather than family connections. It was a look I'd never seen during her years of receiving unearned praise and financial support from our parents. The transformation in our family dynamics had been gradual but profound. My parents had initially resented the new structure, struggling to accept their reduced authority and the accountability measures I'd implemented. But as the business improved and their own stress levels decreased, they'd begun to appreciate the clarity that came with defined roles and transparent expectations. My father knocked on my office door, carrying the monthly financial reports that had become our regular review ritual. His relationship with me had evolved from the angry confrontation of those first weeks to something resembling professional respect. He still struggled with having his younger daughter as his boss, but he could no longer deny the positive results of my leadership. Revenue is up 18% from last quarter, he reported, settling into the chair across from my desk. Client retention is at 92%, and we've got a waiting list for new projects extending into next year. The numbers reflected the systematic changes I'd implemented, but they also represented something more significant: the restoration of the company's reputation for excellence that had been gradually eroding under previous management. Word of mouth in the Phoenix construction market was everything, and satisfied clients were becoming our best source of new business. What about the employee satisfaction surveys? I asked, referring to the quarterly assessments I'd instituted to monitor workplace culture. Highest scores we've ever recorded, my father admitted, though his tone suggested he still didn't fully understand the connection between employee satisfaction and business performance. Most of the comments mentioned feeling respected and valued in ways they hadn't experienced before. The employee feedback had been one of the most rewarding aspects of my new role. Workers who'd felt undervalued and overlooked under the previous management structure were flourishing under clear expectations, fair compensation, and recognition for quality work. Several long-term employees had told me personally how much they appreciated working for a company that honored the principles Rosa and Miguel had established. There's something else we need to discuss, my father continued, his expression growing serious. I've been thinking about my role here, about the future, about what I want to do with the remaining years of my career. I waited for him to continue, recognizing the weight behind his words. Over the past months, our relationship had slowly rebuilt itself on a foundation of mutual respect rather than the complicated dynamics of parent and child. He'd proven himself to be an excellent operations manager when freed from the pressure of ownership decisions, and I'd come to value his experience and institutional knowledge. I want to propose a partnership arrangement, he said, pulling out a document he'd clearly spent significant time preparing. Not ownership, I understand that's not possible given Rosa's will, but a formal recognition of my contributions and a stake in the company's future success. I reviewed his proposal, which outlined a performance-based profit-sharing agreement that would give him additional compensation tied to the company's growth and success. It was a reasonable request from someone who dedicated 20 years of his life to building the business, even if he made mistakes in how he'd managed family dynamics. This is fair, I said after reviewing the details, but I want to add performance metrics related to employee satisfaction and client retention, not just financial results. He nodded, understanding that my priorities extended beyond simple profitability to include the values-based approach that had always distinguished Martinez Construction from its competitors. There's one more thing, he said, his voice becoming more personal. I owe you an apology, Jessica. Not just for the inheritance situation, but for years of not seeing your value, not recognizing your contributions, not treating you with the respect you deserved. The apology was long overdue, but hearing it now carried more weight because it came after months of observing my leadership and seeing the results of the decisions he'd once questioned. It wasn't just words prompted by guilt or necessity, but acknowledgement based on evidence and experience. I appreciate that, Dad, feeling a release of tension I'd carried for decades.
But the important thing is moving forward in a way that honors what Rosa and Miguel built while creating opportunities for everyone to succeed. That afternoon, I drove to Rosa's house, which had become my weekend retreat and the place where I went to think through important decisions. The neighborhood had grown more valuable as Phoenix expanded, but it retained the character that had drawn my grandparents to settle there decades earlier. I'd kept the house exactly as Rosa had left it, turning it into a shrine to family history while using it as my personal sanctuary. In her kitchen, I found the recipe box where she'd kept not just cooking instructions, but also handwritten notes about family events, business decisions, and her observations about her children and grandchildren. Reading through her careful notations, I could trace the evolution of her thinking about our family's future and the gradual development of the plan she'd ultimately implemented through her will. One note dated just a year before her death captured her dilemma perfectly. Roberto and Linda think they are helping Amanda by giving her everything, but they are stealing her chance to become strong. They think they are teaching Jessica independence by giving her nothing, but they are teaching her that love must be earned while worthlessness is assumed. Both daughters deserve better from their parents. The insight in those words reflected the wisdom of someone who'd observed family dynamics with the clarity that comes from unconditional love combined with practical experience. Rosa had understood that my parents' approach was damaging both Amanda and me in different ways, and she used her final act as family matriarch to force a correction. Tyler arrived as I was preparing dinner, bringing wine and the easy companionship that had sustained me through the most challenging months of this transition. Our friendship had deepened as I'd navigated the complexities of business ownership and family reconciliation, his legal expertise invaluable, but his emotional support even more important. "How are things at the home office?" he asked, settling into Rosa's worn
Kitchen chairs as I prepared her famous chicken mole recipe from memory. Better than I expected, I admitted, stirring the complex sauce that required patience and attention to develop properly. Amanda's becoming genuinely competent. Dad's accepting his new role, and the business is thriving. I think Rosa would be pleased with how everything's turning out. Tyler had been skeptical about my decision to keep my family involved in the business, arguing that a clean break might have been simpler and less emotionally complicated. But he'd come to appreciate the wisdom of Rosa's approach, which had forced growth and accountability rather than simply redistributing wealth. "Any word on the Paradise Valley house situation?" he asked, referring to the mansion Amanda and Kevin had been forced to sell when their expected inheritance evaporated. "They're renting a modest place in Tempe now," I said, tasting the mole and adjusting the seasoning. "Kevin finally got a real job at an accounting firm, and Amanda says they're actually happier without the pressure of maintaining appearances they couldn't afford." The financial reality check had been brutal for Amanda and Kevin, but it had also freed them from the unsustainable lifestyle they'd built around expectations of future wealth. Amanda had confided that their marriage was stronger now, that they were facing challenges together rather than living off family support that bred resentment and entitlement. As we ate dinner by candlelight in Rosa's dining room, I found myself reflecting on the unexpected turns my life had taken since that devastating family dinner 8 months earlier. I'd gone from feeling completely excluded from my family's future to becoming the person responsible for preserving and protecting that future. The power dynamic had shifted so dramatically that I sometimes felt like I was living someone else's life. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Rosa hadn't left you the business?" Tyler asked, reading my contemplative mood correctly. "Sometimes," I said, considering the alternate timeline where my parents had followed through on their plan to leave everything to Amanda. "I think the business would have failed within 5 years. Amanda wasn't ready for that kind of responsibility, and my parents were making too many risky decisions to sustain long-term success." The analysis was based on hard data rather than family sentiment. Martinez Construction's financial projections under the previous management approach had shown dangerous vulnerability to market fluctuations and client loss. Rosa's intervention had prevented not just personal injustice, but potential business catastrophe. "More importantly," I continued, "I think our family would have remained broken in ways that might never have healed. This forced everyone to confront uncomfortable truths and make real changes instead of just continuing destructive patterns."
The conversation continued late into the evening, covering everything from business strategy to family psychology to my personal goals for the future. Having someone who understood both the professional and emotional complexities of my situation was invaluable, especially during moments when the weight of responsibility felt overwhelming. The next morning brought a surprise visit from my mother, who arrived carrying a box of old photographs and documents she'd found while cleaning out storage areas at their house. Since my father's partnership proposal had been accepted, my parents had been making subtle but significant changes in their own lives, downsizing their lifestyle and focusing on activities that brought genuine satisfaction rather than status. "I thought you might want these," she said, spreading the contents across Rosa's kitchen table. "They're mostly pictures from the early days of the business, when your grandmother and grandfather were getting started." The photographs told the story of Martinez Construction's humble beginnings in ways that corporate records couldn't capture. There was Rosa in work clothes, her hands dirty from mixing cement, standing proudly next to Miguel as they broke ground on their first major project. Another showed the entire extended family celebrating the completion of their 10th house, everyone crowded together in front of a modest suburban home that had represented a major milestone. "She would have been so proud of what you've accomplished," my mother said, her voice soft with emotion as she looked at a picture of Rosa teaching a young version of me to use a measuring tape. "She always said you had the Martinez determination, the willingness to work for what you wanted instead of expecting it to be handed to you." The comment was as close to an acknowledgement of past mistakes as my mother was likely to make, but it carried the weight of genuine recognition. She'd never been as openly hostile as my father during the transition period, but she'd also never explicitly acknowledged the unfairness of their previous treatment. "I've been thinking about Rosa's letters," my mother continued, referring to the documents Mr. Burke had shown me that detailed my grandmother's concerns about family dynamics. "About the things she wrote about Amanda and you, about the mistakes we made as parents." I waited for her to continue, recognizing that this conversation had been building for months as my mother processed the implications of Rosa's final decisions. "We thought we were protecting Amanda by making life easy for her. We thought we were building your character by making you earn everything yourself. But Rosa was right. We were hurting both of you in different ways." The admission was painful but necessary, representing the kind of honest self-reflection that had been absent from my family's dynamics for decades. My mother had always been more emotionally aware than my father, but she'd also been more conflict avoidant, choosing family peace over difficult conversations that might have prevented years of accumulated damage. "What matters now is how we move forward," I said, echoing the philosophy that had guided all my decisions since claiming my inheritance. "The past can't be changed, but we can make better choices going forward." She nodded, tears forming in her eyes as she looked at a photograph of all 4 grandchildren gathered around Rosa during one of our last family holidays together. "I want to be a better mother to both my daughters. I want to be someone Rosa would have been proud to call family." The conversation marked another milestone in our family's gradual healing process. Change had come slowly and sometimes painfully, but it had come authentically, driven by necessity and evidence rather than guilt or obligation. Later that week, I received a call from Mrs. Dorothy Kellerman, the elderly neighbor who'd been friends with Rosa for over 30 years. Renovation of the Martinez Construction headquarters and wanted to share her memories of my grandmother's hopes for the family business. "Rosa used to talk about you all the time," Mrs. Kellerman said, as we sat in her living room looking through photo albums that chronicled decades of neighborhood history. "She was so proud of your education, your work ethic, your determination to succeed on your own terms." The validation from someone who'd known Rosa intimately felt like receiving a message from my grandmother herself. Mrs. Kellerman had been present for countless conversations about family dynamics, business decisions, and Rosa's growing concerns about the direction things were heading. "She was worried about Amanda, too," Mrs. Kellerman continued, "not because she didn't love her, but because she could see how the constant rescuing was preventing her from developing her own strength.
The perspective confirmed what I'd already suspected. Rosa's decision to leave me the business hadn't been about punishment or favoritism, but about love expressed through difficult choices designed to help everyone reach their potential. Your grandmother always said that real love sometimes requires saying no, Mrs. Kellerman added. She believed that enabling someone's weaknesses was cruel, while challenging their strengths was kind. As autumn arrived in Phoenix, bringing relief from the summer heat and the promise of a busy construction season ahead, I found myself taking stock of everything that had changed since Rosa's will had upended our family's assumptions. The business was thriving, my relationships with family members had evolved in positive directions, and I'd discovered capabilities I'd never been allowed to develop while living in the shadow of my parents' favoritism. The final vindication came during Martinez Construction's annual Employee Appreciation Dinner, an event I'd reinstated to honor the workers whose skills and dedication made everything else possible. The gathering was held at a modest restaurant in the heart of Phoenix, chosen for its authentic Mexican cuisine that would have reminded Rosa and McGill of their own cultural roots. Standing before the assembled employees, their families, and the clients who'd become friends over years of quality work, I felt the full weight of the legacy I'd inherited and the responsibility I'd accepted. These weren't just jobs and contracts, but livelihoods and relationships built on trust and mutual respect. When my grandparents founded this company 40 years ago, I said, looking out at faces that ranged from teenagers working their first construction jobs to veterans who'd been with the company since its early days, they had a simple vision: to build homes and buildings that would last, to treat workers fairly, and to serve clients with integrity. The applause was warm and genuine, reflecting the renewed sense of purpose that had energized the entire organization. Several employees had told me privately that they'd considered leaving during the final years under my parents' management, frustrated by the emphasis on quick profits over quality craftsmanship. Now, they were recommending the company to friends and family, proud to be associated with an organization that reflected their own values. Tonight, we're not just celebrating another successful year, we're celebrating the continuation of principles that have guided this company through future that honors the past while embracing new possibilities. Amanda stood near the back of the room with Kevin, both of them applauding with enthusiasm that would have seemed forced 8 months earlier, but now appeared genuinely heartfelt. The challenges they'd faced had strengthened their marriage and forced them to develop resources they'd never needed while living off family support. My parents sat at a table with some of the long-term employees, participating in conversations about upcoming projects and shared memories of company milestones. My father's role as operations manager had given him a new sense of purpose, while my mother had found satisfaction in administrative work that contributed to something larger than maintaining social appearances. As the evening concluded and people began saying their goodbyes, I found myself approached by Carlos Mendoza, the company's senior foreman who'd worked alongside Miguel during the company's founding years. He was one of the few people who remembered my grandparents as active participants in daily operations, rather than distant figures from family stories. "Your grandfather would have been proud tonight," he said, his weathered hands clasped in front of him as he spoke with the dignity of someone who'd built his career on honest labor. He always said the company belonged to everyone who contributed to its success, not just the people whose names were on the paperwork. The comment captured something essential about Rosa and Miguel's vision that had been lost during my parents' management, but was being restored under my leadership. The business wasn't just a source of family wealth, but a community institution that provided opportunities and stability for dozens of families. "Rosa knew what she was doing when she left you in charge," Carlos continued. "She could see that you understood what really mattered, what was worth preserving and protecting." Driving home through the Phoenix streets where my grandparents had built their American dream, I felt a deep sense of completion that had nothing to do with revenge or vindication, and everything to do with purpose fulfilled. The next morning, I received an unexpected phone call from Amanda, her voice excited in a way I hadn't heard since we were children. "Jessica, I have an idea I want to run by you," she said, the enthusiasm in her voice infectious despite the early hour. "What would you think about starting a restoration division focused on historic properties? I've been researching the market, and there's significant demand for contractors who specialize in preserving older buildings while updating them for modern use." The proposal was sophisticated and well-researched, showing Amanda had developed genuine business insight through her months of hands-on experience. More importantly, it represented her first independent contribution to the company's strategic direction, rather than simply fulfilling assigned responsibilities. I love it, I said, meaning every word. Prepare a full presentation for next week's management meeting. If the numbers work, we'll make it happen. The conversation ended with both of us laughing about something trivial, the easy interaction
Of sisters who'd finally found their way to mutual respect and genuine affection. It was a relationship Rosa would have recognized and approved of, built on individual strength rather than competitive comparison. That afternoon, I sat in Rosa's garden, now beautifully maintained by a landscaping service I'd hired to preserve her careful work. The vegetables and flowers she tended with such care continued to flourish, their seasonal cycles marking the passage of time and the continuation of life beyond individual human stories. In my hands was the final letter Rosa had left for me, one I'd discovered just that morning in a box of her personal effects. This one was different from the others, written not as guidance for specific situations, but as a general expression of love and confidence in my ability to carry forward what she and Miguel had built. "My dearest Jessica," the letter began, "if you are reading this, it means you have accepted the responsibility I placed on your shoulders and are wondering whether you made the right choices. Let me ease your mind. There are no perfect choices, only choices made with love and integrity and faith in the future." Her words continued for several pages, sharing memories of my childhood visits, observations about my character, and hopes for what I might accomplish with the opportunities she was providing. But the final paragraph captured everything I needed to know about her motivations and expectations. "You have always been the bridge between what our family was and what it could become," she wrote. "Not because you are perfect, but because you understand that love sometimes requires difficult decisions, that fairness sometimes demands uncomfortable changes, and that protecting what matters most sometimes means disappointing people who have grown comfortable with what is wrong." As the sun set over Phoenix, painting the desert landscape in shades of gold and crimson that had drawn people to this place for generations, I felt the profound satisfaction of work completed and trust honored. Rosa's legacy was secure, my family was healing, and the future stretched ahead full of possibilities that none of us could have imagined when this journey began. The next morning would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and new chances to prove worthy of the trust that had been placed in me. But tonight, sitting in the garden my grandmother had tended with such care, I was simply grateful for the gift of seeing clearly, choosing wisely, and building something worthy of the love that had made it all possible. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.